pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth...
What do you mean? I couldn't be the President of the United States of America. Tell me something, it's still we, the people, right? If there's a new way, I'll be the first in line. But it better work this time. My friends, this is Agitators Anonymous, episode 116. I'm Alan Averill, and you are very welcome to Friday's episode. Hello me, meet the real me. Indeed, well, at least meet the me who spent most of the pandemic and lockdown whinging and whining, complaining, moaning, or, depending on your point of view, being very deep and insightful about politics. Well, something I should probably stay away from, but here we are. Let's have a little bit of realpolitik today, my friends. So just a little bit of housekeeping and this and that kind of thing before we get started. Primordial's only club show in Germany is on the 22nd of July in Dresden at the Reithaller Straße E, Werner Hartmann Straße 2 in Dresden. We're playing with Of the Wand and the Moon, which is pretty interesting and pretty cool. And as of right now, it looks like being the only small German club show that Primordial has all year. So, yeah, try and get to that one, write that down, mark it down, all that kind of thing. Namthiang_Primordial is the Instagram, and Primordial_official if you want to follow our rather mundane and trivial adventures over on the gram. You can support the show on patreon.com/Alan Averill. There ain't no tiers, as I can't figure them out yet. Rehearsals, other podcasts, all that kind of thing. And let's get the sponsorship stuff out of the way. The show is sponsored by metalblade.com. In North America, you can use the promo code ALAN and you will get 10% off your order. And that includes Canada as well in that deal. The links are underneath in the description. Also, Hate Couture is a French up and coming, getting pretty popular, getting a lot of headlines, I suppose. Hateful yet tasteful apparel, loads of cool stuff. Of course, you need an inverted cross bottle opener. You need some cool board shorts with Vlad the Impaler on them, all that kind of thing. You can go to www.hatecouture, HATECOUTURE616.com/. You can find the links in the description. Use the promo code ALAN and you can get free shipping, which right now comes at quite the advantage because it is exorbitant and utterly ridiculous, just like the cost of everything else in your world right now. So as you can probably hear, I sound a little bit under the weather. No, it is not. It is not the big C. It is just being old and a little bit run down and hitting it a bit too hard at the weekend. When I was at Hellfest, our little cabin was beside the Cro-Mags, and I had a very brief, "Hey, how are you doing?" exchange with Harley Flanagan, who doesn't know me from Adam. And the man is in quite exceptional shape. Maybe we all need to take a little leaf out of Harley's book. Harley's War, yeah, all that kind of thing. I think I really could. So if my voice does not have its usual dulcet, resonant tones, then I do apologize. You can blame it on the weekend. Yes, not the weekend, but the weekend. Okay, so let's get into a bit of this. Why is your financial independence under threat? Now, of course, the caveat being, as I always say when beginning these kind of discussions, they are discussions about potentialities. I'm not saying they're certainties, and that is quite different. So, I mean, if something like this, somebody wants to rake through the podcast in 2 or 3 years and go, aha, you said this. Well, look, the podcast wouldn't be that much fun and it wouldn't be very exciting. It wouldn't be called Agitators Anonymous if it was just me going, yeah, some things might happen, but, you know, probably not. Sure, just relax, chillax, take it easy. That wouldn't be much of a podcast. And of course, it wouldn't really be my style. So, although I've said it several times over the last few months, I understand the great feeling of wariness and inertia most people have over 3 words like the Great Reset or about politics in general. And look, I'm going to talk about Dutch farming in this episode. Yep, that's what we're going to talk about. Not just 80 speed metal. That's the Tuesday's episodes. But we're going to talk a little tiny bit about the farming, the agrarian culture in the Netherlands. The Netherlands. At least, what can we say? Outside of the percentage of people still fighting the good fight in the culture wars, there is a great sense of weariness in approaching some of these topics. However, in fairness, when it comes to these battles, these games, they've had some pitch repairs to the old abortion battleground lately for some new Super Sunday clashes. I'm not going to get into that quite yet. Maybe on some other ill-advised podcast I will, but I'm not going to get into that. In general, I sense very few people want to wade back into the murky waters of lockdown politics, or at least the politics that have been following and are following in the wake of lockdown and the pandemic, as they've only just really been able to see their feet again in the sort of shallow waters. Wow, what some terrible metaphors going on there. I do apologise for those things. What can I say? I'm feeling a bit under the weather. My brain fog is still, it's still enveloping my grey matter. But I do fear many political, cultural, technological and frankly authoritarian movements that found their modus operandi, their mode of being, over the pandemic are going to become more and more relevant to our lives as we move forward, and more relevant to our daily discussions, if they are not already. Now, like I said, of course, my own personal caveat, and what I say every time I discuss things like this, is, of course, nothing is absolute. I'm not saying 100% of these things may happen, but I'm certainly not saying 0% of them either. The truth will, of course, be somewhere in the grey area, and there's no doubt about it. But even if 25% of some of these things do come true, they can have massive implications and ramifications for your day-to-day living. But in terms of this podcast, your finances and your financial freedom, of course, that has been the kind of keynote, the background movement behind all of the podcasts, the concepts of liberty being the most important word in the English language. Come at me if you disagree. However, the truth is that 0% is not going to happen either. 0% of these prognostications, these things that I'm considering right now and I'm about to get into, these things may collapse under the weight of their own bureaucracy. Many things throughout the last 20, 30, 40 years have just been a glint in the eye of a pushy civil servant that never went any further than just being drafts, governmental drafts. Just, of course, these days in the age of modern media and information overload, we hear about everything that maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago we didn't hear about every movement within governmental circles. But I'm going to kind of look at that, the fact that everything seems to be sort of opaque now. Even the most fundamentally dastardly authoritarian and undemocratic concepts don't even seem to be they don't even seem to bother hiding them anymore. It's just like, well, look, it's out there. Do whatever you want to do. However, some of this might collapse under its own bureaucracy. As I said, my brain fog is quite profound today. But it could be that governments around the world realize, the absolute folly of elements of what unelected technocrats are trying to impose on us. And they, sometimes they listen to the people and they move to oppose those things. Now, I'm not too sure whether that's going to happen right now, but your government might include, in fact, some of those very people who, they are lobbied by those unelected technocrats. What the fuck am I talking about? What the fuck am I talking about indeed? I'm going to try and connect a few dots as regard our personal economic freedom and, of course, good old-fashioned liberty. A man's house is his castle, right? In fact, one of the reasons, just to go off on a tiny tangent, one of the reasons, for example, North America economically triumphed while South America, with far more of the natural resources, did not, is the ownership of land. It's the working off of your indentured servitude, or whatever you want to say. The ownership of land is part of what our concept of freedom is built upon. The right to own your own piece of land, to build on it as you see fit, and therefore have the roof over your head to bring up your family with a certain amount of certainty in the world that you had this roof over your head, metaphorically and very real in the physical corporeal sense. But as the Great Reset tells you, you will own nothing and you will be happy, right? I mean, I have no doubt wherever you are in the world, it is becoming harder and harder to buy a house, right? Certainly in Dublin, a whole generation of people will not own somewhere to live, but end up having to pay rent. Not from individual landlords like before. I mean, you know, back in the day, in the 90s, when we used signed to Hammerheart Records with the band, we spent a lot of time in Holland. And, you know, talking to those guys and their families, they would say, yeah, we have a deal with, you know, a 50-year rental deal, inflation linked with the local state or the local council, etc., etc. This is not exactly what I'm talking about when we talk about the government or BlackRock or Chinese investment firms buying up all of the living space in your city. There's a slightly different thing going on there. But this generation, which includes me, my generation, will almost exclusively end up having to rent, but not from individual landlords like before, but governments. And like I said, the likes of these investment firms. And considering how we're going to talk about these things are going to be potentially tethered to your financial freedom, let's discuss a bit about that. However, there is something sort of important that's happening in the news that caught my eye, that I wanted to sort of go over a bit. And that is that Dutch farmers are protesting at the government's declaration that they will, before 2030, seize farmland. And in essence, along with the plan for, if I don't misunderstand this, 1/5 of Europe, to all intents and purposes, rewild it. Now, I have to say that for those of you who cheer on any and all climate restrictions, your little mini Attenborough inside you on your shoulder, screaming with delight and banging its feet. I get it. I really do get it. And I think there is a terrible sense that any discussions about climate change, and also climate restrictions and climate lockdown is never quite fairly heard. You can't really bring up any questions about it because the reaction is so emotional. And, you know, whereas, during COVID, it was, do you want my grandmother to die? Now it's, do you want my planet to die? And the answer is, no, of course not. But I got some questions. And that should always be the answer, that there can be a debate in the middle to reach a consensus. And the idea that every issue that is put to us about climate is put to us from a truthful perspective, as in governments. And I'm not saying that, for example, climate change itself is not, being pushed on by man-made being helped along the way by our own machinations. What I'm trying to say is governmental procedures, governmental proposals that don't really have climate at their heart. What they have is systems of control and manipulation. Now, that's the kind of sidestep discussion that I would like to get into. The idea that our climate argument might also be used to enact measures of societal control. That's what I want to discuss. The debate is, after all, the climate debate, I think for the most part, is an industrial one, right? And what you do as a suburban individual in Helsinki or Copenhagen or Dublin or wherever you're from, it really matters little compared to what massive Chinese factories do. Or throughout the developing world, and of course, for among multinational corporations across the West, and the polluting of the atmosphere that they do, and they're lobbying to get round all of these restrictions, or all of this with governments all across the West. And what you do, personally, I think matters less. But of course, the idea is, through a sort of sense of Western collective guilt, could this climate change argument be used to seize elements of our personal liberty or civil liberties, that kind of thing? That's the kind of thing that I want to discuss. But of course, it's very hard to do that because most people don't see past the first part of that argument and they think, are you saying that this isn't happening? No, not at all. But there is a discussion to be had. What is and what is not real can sometimes be hard to ascertain, and what is being used to play your sense of guilt is also sometimes difficult and hard to ascertain. Yet it will, as individuals, you may be over the coming decade asked to give up more and more of your personal rights, but sold to you under the guise of climate. This is kind of what I'm trying to get at. So try and emotionally detach yourself from the argument and consider the implications on this level, as this is what I'm going to talk about today. The Dutch government, headed by Mark Rutte, never heard of him before, headed by this guy, who it would appear is a form, at least to me from the outside looking in, a form of a mini Trudeau in the making, an acolyte, a minion of the World Economic Forum, is discussing through this plan, which is connected to Agenda 2030, of seizing land from uncooperative farmers. Nitrogen emissions. Nitrogen. Yeah, you know, you've heard the joke, they want us eating bugs. Well, anyway, you consider a digital passport, as I talked about many times before, a biometric passport, ID linked to your health that advises you at first. You should make some better choices with your life. But then as time passes, reduces your capacity to make choices about what food you buy. Shouldn't you eat less meat, etc., etc.? I'll try and explain where I'm coming from with this. I will say off the top that messing with the food production chain has had some disastrous consequences over the 20th century. One only has to look at Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, which killed around 50 million people, to see where it can lead. Now, of course, I'm being slightly disingenuous, reaching for the top shelf disaster to illustrate my point. But I will say, fiddling and messing with food production of all things can have disastrous consequences. But reading the EU proposal, it would appear the nitrogen levels in the wild, yeah, I kid you not, may be morally more important than, you being able to feed your kid, is kind of the implications. At least to me, moving to disrupt the food chain is playing with fire, as I always say. We, as a species in the civilized world, are only 3 days away from a zombie apocalypse if we cannot feed our kids. If the shelves are not full, then give people 3 or 4 days and they will riot and they will tear apart the places in order to feed their kids. In other places in the world who have a kind of can't farm today, can't eat tomorrow idea. You probably heard me say that before when a friend of mine from Morocco said that to me, who I play football with. He just went, Alan, you guys are too rich. We are in a kind of can't eat today or can't eat tomorrow because we can't farm today sort of idea, in that people are working to feed themselves. And so in a sense, the means of production are within their hands, so to say, whereas the means of food production kind of aren't really in your day-to-day hands, especially if you're not working the gig economy, the IT, tech, pajama party economy. If you go into your local shop after work and you go, oh, there ain't no food, now we have a problem, right? So they say that we're only 3 or 4 days away from the shelves not being full till people riot. So Mark Rutte has, it would seem, called in the Dutch military to deal with some of this. Now, how they deal with the farmers' protests remains to be seen, but by all accounts, they are already labelling them as extremists. And pretty soon, I would imagine, fascists. But it might be possible they copy a page from Trudeau's authoritarian playbook when he dealt with the Canadian trucker protest, and they start freezing assets, which to me, at least, this was one of the most pivotal moments of the lockdown period, and showed the intent to remove normal people's right to protest. And by all accounts, just looking at things this morning before starting this, these are some of the claims that are being laid against them. I don't think they've quite gone to calling them Nazis yet, because I think this has a different resonance in Europe than maybe in Canada. But, Trudeau simply called the truckers Nazis, and whatever phobia and ism fitted his woke narrative, and in the end, never met with them, never debated them, because he didn't have to. Once he labelled them as that, then you don't have to. And I really want you to consider, on these terms, the use of the word Nazi over the last decade. The technocratic powers that be, at least to me, have been seeding the use of this word in society for about a decade. It used to be a really heavy thing to call someone. You were called that in the 90s, or so you called someone that in the 90s. It was greeted with a ooh in the classroom of like, fucking hell, you went there, wow. But now it just seems to really mean little more than someone I kind of disagree with, and it's thrown about with way too much abandon, and the word has kind of lost its weight, its meaning, its seriousness. But what it's also done, and I think this has been used by governments and people like Trudeau, for example, it just basically means now I don't need to debate you or listen to your argument or even hear what you have to say. You know what? They never found those weapons of mass destruction in Iraq either, did they? But keep watching to see if that kind of language appears or starts to be used by the Dutch Prime Minister. It seems that just the go-to to shut people down and never have to debate them in an open public forum. Certainly, I watched a parliamentary debate in the Dutch Parliament, and he dismisses questions put to him about the Great Reset. He just goes, it's conspiracy theory. And then I went back and watched another video presentation where he is, it would seem, addressing the World Economic Forum, or clearly referencing them. So, lying, basically, I would say. Well, at least it would appear to me so. When it's clear through, as I said, these other interviews, he knows very well about its implications. Oh, bugs, I tell you. Well, they do want to reduce livestock emissions, nitrogen. So what's the beef? Oh, you can have that one for free. So therefore, of course, this means fewer grain farms as they, these are needed to feed the livestock. And they've simply written, there is not a future for all farmers in this approach, the Dutch government say. So they basically are saying to them, hey, learn to code, deal with it. And there are still people who will call Agenda 2030, it's just a conspiracy theory. So if they dismantle the Dutch rural farming economy, who, as I understand it, are the second biggest exporters of meat in the world after the USA, could be getting that wrong, but they're the second biggest, something or other connected to this after the USA. Aren't we all living right now in the post-Ukraine war economy, right? Remember how much we were told the war in Ukraine it's a disaster when it comes to grain, and this is why food prices are rising. Surely dismantling the Dutch agrarian farming economy would do the same to the European food production line. I don't know. Apparently the Dutch Farmers' Party have, according to one poll, 4.6% of the vote, but this could rise and they could end up with 11 members of parliament as a projection. And I've said this before in the podcast, if we take the World Economic Forum at face value, and what they want for our future, then the dismantling of democracy has to be part of that. It just simply gets in the way. Oh, do we have a democracy anyway, Alan? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I get it. Stop with the whataboutery. I get it. It was never perfect, but wasn't lockdown a good example of shutting down the civil liberties involved in democracy? Your government, no doubt, as has mine, they enacted emergency powers, and God damn it, they really, really liked them, didn't they? They really didn't want to go back to asking the pesky public. But the pandemic and the suspension of democracy set a precedent. Watch this space. And that is that emergency powers don't need to be put to the public. So if we're in climate emergency, then obviously you don't need to ask the farmers really about if they mind that you shut down their entire economy, their livelihood, their, historical culture, and also, their future economically, etc., etc. You know what I mean. And there is one thing that really kind of came to my mind as an observation comparing things from decades past. Now, it may just be, of course, that I was a young fella in Dublin. But Dublin and Ireland could be brought to a standstill in the 80s if the state crossed farmers. I mean, Ireland is traditionally a farming, it's a farming society. Other than tourism, it would have been our biggest economy. And it's traditionally what Ireland was built upon, our dairy economy. And you knew very well that if the state crossed farmers, the whole of the city centre would be shut down by farmers driving their trucks and their whatever else up and just blocking motorways everywhere. And in fact, I remember many moments spent listening to the news on the radio and when there was this strike and that standoff between the various union groups and state officials. And not just in relation to Ireland, but also the EU. And you always heard about the EU butter mountain, the EU dairy quotas, and the EU this, that, and the other. And are we going to allow Eastern European countries into the EU, this, that, and the other? And what can they provide when it comes to all of these things? And yet now, is it my imagination, or is COVID, the lockdown and the pandemic, quite simply emboldened governments in the West to not feel like they need to even consult the people? Or that working class people might push back against the idea that, hey, some of you farmers won't have jobs, tough. Feeding your kids as a society is less important than nitrogen emissions. Deal with it. Got nowhere to live? Deal with it. They got their emergency powers and emergency situations during lockdown when they simply didn't have to consult the people. So now, who cares? Eat bugs, live in a pod, put your goggles on. Stay in the metaverse and consume. We are going to educate your kids within the metaverse. And never mind this pesky thing called democracy. Or am I just being hyperbolic? Of course I'm being hyperbolic. The podcast is called Agitators Anonymous. The clue is in the name. It would be all a bit boring if I wasn't a little bit on the dramatic side, of course. God damn it, I'm feeling a bit Marxist today. As the man said, seize the means of production. Don't set out to destroy it. That's a common misconception. Pub chat, my friends. What am I leading to with this? And this is what the main thrust of the podcast is that I wanted to get to. My main midweek thrust. What am I leading to with this? And look, I can hold my hand up and say, I don't fully understand Bitcoin. I've tried. I kind of do. I understand the principle, a decentralized net banking network. I understand the concept of mining, the sort of ledger aspect of it. But everyone I know who got into it has lost money. Pretty much everyone. Greater and larger amounts. The people who advocate for it, although on some level have done a reasonable job explaining it, cannot still really tell me how it affects my day to day. But for sure, of course, governments and the old banking system have noticed. And as we talk, I think 86 banks around the world are creating their own CBDC. What is CBDC? CBDC stands for Central Bank Digital Currency. And this would appear to me to be the old institutions morphing to challenge Bitcoin. One of the greatest things about Bitcoin is its decentralized network. But this would do the exact opposite. And as I stated at the top, it could be used as a great measure of social control. Now, Rishi Sunak, the UK minister, has just resigned. I'm not sure what the implications of that are for the things that I'm discussing in this podcast. I mean, maybe he resigned because of a slander or a slur I said about him during the lockdown. Who knows? Maybe it really got to him and got under his skin and he decided, I can't live with the condemnation of that Averill chap. Anyway, he, prior to this, had been urging all G7 nations to implement this as soon as possible. So what would it mean, and why could it be put to use for so much evil? Well, it basically means as we move to a more cashless society that the government would issue its own form of crypto, basically, its own digital currency. And here is where it gets dark. It would be, or could be, but I would say would be, programmable. The government could program in restrictions, for example, that you cannot buy a flight with this state CBDC. You do not, in essence, have financial autonomy that you had before, as in your paycheck comes in digitally to your bank account every month, but it's not the euro as you knew before. You can't just take it out as you wish and do whatever you wish with it, but it has programmable restrictions within it. Let's examine them. Let's say it says you cannot buy more alcohol than you need. This is only X amount of units. And you can already see that during the pandemic, at least we saw this very clearly in Ireland, certain health ministers saw the pandemic as an advantage to try and tackle culturally Ireland's drinking issues. Now, some of you may think that seems like a good idea. Personally, I think it's really up to you. It's your personal liberty. It's your personal decision. But imagine, so then you get your CBDC payment to you every month, or now it could be your UBI, your Universal Basic Income, paid to you in CBDC. And therefore it will come with caveats and restrictions and all this kind of stuff. So maybe it will say, well, I think you've bought enough alcohol this month. Maybe you're not going to be able to buy tobacco with it, for example. We already see several countries looking to move against vaping. This is happening in the USA. And tobacco. New Zealand talking about ultimately banning tobacco. Talking about banning it completely. Another satellite state of the World Economic Forum, or at least their dear leader is. And so what you have is a digital currency that is tightly controlled by the state. Now, I don't know about you, but the freedom to do as I please with what I earn is basically the reason that I work, or the reason that you work, I would imagine, to not have Big Brother pulling your purse strings. But if you ask me, this is exactly what could be planned for us. And it will be sold to us as the idea that this unelected technocratic elite know what's best for us to, quote unquote, save the planet, amongst many other things. But imagine that this CBDC, this digital currency, has an expiry date. Because, in times of crisis, people want to hold on to their money as things seem uncertain. But the state wants you to spend it. What if it had a 30-day expiry limit? What if the digital... Now let's get to the hub of this. But what if this digital currency was frozen for protesting? Or if your GPS placed you at a certain protest that the government deemed undesirable, or a protest against your government, such as the Dutch farmers or such as the Canadian truckers, and you woke to find your phone turned red and you were unable to use your passcode to get into your various different financial platforms. You were unable to buy a train ticket, or you were unable to buy a certain kind of food. You were unable to buy enough food, or anything other than a few essentials. Sounds a bit like what certain supermarkets were practicing during lockdown, right? Remember when they only allowed you to buy essentials? Do you think maybe that was a kind of a bit prepping for the future? I don't want to sound like one of those let's build a bunker in the back garden guys, one of those end of world preppers or whatever they're called. Like I said, I'm just having a practical discussion about some of the things that, could happen. They might not happen. I mean, they might, but why did so many governments around the world bring in so many new laws to move against your right to protest? Oh, it's going to be too noisy for the poor people in the suburbs or whatever else. Am I connecting too many dots? Am I overreaching? The fact is that all of this already exists in China, a country many of the World Economic Forum leaders and their government plants around the world, like Trudeau, have expressed admiration for. And they have also, the CCP has made keynote speeches to the World Economic Forum. Now link this, for example, link all of this to a personal carbon footprint. And we enter the realms of a form of climate lockdown. Or lockdown might be the wrong word, but climate restrictions. Now, for someone living on an island, this scares the fuck out of me. The idea of being stuck on this rainy, cold, grey outpost without the ability to travel, which is your right to own a passport, to travel, to move. But hey, Alan, why will you want to travel when you can just use your Oculus Rift glasses to be able to look at those places instead of go there in the real world and just sit there atrophying into some putrescent physical mess on your couch? Lots of heavy metal sort of words in there. Oculus Rift, what a bloody cool name, by the way. I'm pretty sure the people who invented that have to have been metal fans. Oculus Rift, that is a killer black metal pseudonym. Anyway, step into the metaverse, indeed. And of course, it goes without saying, a personal carbon footprint is the end of touring, the end of live festivals, the end of traveling to play gigs, all those kind of events. They are just gone. It will be all local. Of course, you go, oh, that's why you're invested in this. No, not only. But you've probably heard your leaders discussing 5-kilometre living. Certainly, our Taoiseach here of the time during the pandemic, Leo, discussed the idea that, oh, wouldn't it be great if everything you needed in your life was just in this 5-kilometre radius? Now, I don't know about you, but this reminds me of living in the 16th century. where people were born, lived and died almost exclusively within the same 5, 10, 15 kilometre radius. Now place that maybe in the context of Northern Ireland, where if you're inside the castle, you're all right, but outside the castle, well, fend for yourself. And that is what I think in essence is being proposed, a sort of form of neo-feudalism. Anyway, a digital currency that could be frozen at will by your governments for dissent. A digital currency you cannot buy what you wish. A digital currency that has an expiry date, but yet it is linked to your phone, to your digital apps, your platforms, maybe even indeed your heart rate, etc. But it monitors your health and decides what is best for you by excluding cigarettes and alcohol, for example. And in essence, all of these things add up to being its own form of contraception on a broader cultural level, right? It will freeze or reduce its worth if you are found guilty of a hate crime, of being in line with those fascist protesters, or if you are in line with the far left or the far right, which we've been led to believe all our neighbours are, while we all tell on each other. A central bank digital currency could very well be all of those things. My money, my choice, right? Yeah, my money, my choice. Let me read you a small excerpt from Klaus Schwab's book, The Great Reset, and ask yourself, does it look or sound familiar? And this comes back to the climate thing. So, airports. This is from Klaus Schwab's. This is from his book. I'm reading it right in front of me. Airports. Airports face the same challenges as airlines. The less people fly, the less they transit via airports. This in turn affects the level of consumption in the various shops and restaurants that make up the ecosystem of all international airports throughout the world. Furthermore, the experience of airports in a post-COVID-19 world involving longer waiting times, highly restricted or even no hand luggage and other potentially inconvenient social distancing measures could erode the consumer desire to travel by air for pleasure and leisure. Various trade associations warn that the implementation of social distancing policies would not only limit airport capacity to 20 to 40%, but would also likely render the whole experience so disagreeable as to become a deterrent. Dramatically affected by the lockdowns, airlines begin to cancel or defer orders for new aircraft and to change their choice of particular model. In doing so, severely impacting the aerospace industry as a direct consequence and for the foreseeable future. Basically, what he's saying in this passage is, let's create chaos in the airports to stop people travelling. And also you pair this with a recent study in the UK which said what we need to do is shut every airport in the UK except for Stansted to offset the climate argument, the climate agenda. Basically, if you put all of these things together, it doesn't take a super informed or super, shall we say, a person who's really, looking that much in depth. If you connect a few of these dots to go, hang on, wait, what? There's a future being formed for you, which is basically stating, stay inside to save the world. And here's the restrictions we're going to form around you, a form of gilded cage. Like I said, take me with a grain of salt if you want. And I would. Of course, all of this could collapse under its own bureaucracy. And some of it is just incredible overreach. Some of it is just obviously patently nonsense. But these are coming to a cinema near you soon, if you ask me. And it may be worth beginning to consider that trailer was made in the first place. Someone made the trailer. And I know some of you don't want to watch it. But I think the first thing some people need to do is to stop using the word or the terms conspiracy theory, to simply put down things they haven't bothered looking into yet and stop accepting governments across the EU demonizing working class people and their concerns as white supremacy or fascism or whatever else. This is simply what they do in order to stoke the culture wars, keep the class war alive and demonize everyday working people and their concerns. And it may sound to some of you like, wow, Alan's sounding vaguely Marxist. Well, maybe so, at least in terms of these things, when I see the concept of holding power to account and the sort of future that seems to be shaped for people without their input, without their knowledge, and by and large, I guess, without their understanding. Of course, as I stated off the top of the podcast, this may not happen. It all may fall apart. And the 400 million people in the Eurozone may just not accept it. Because the other thing is that these potential restrictions in the West, in the EU, I would see are being yoked upon the West, where the money is, in a sense, to squeeze and force out the middle class, to create basically like a worldwide lower class and a sort of neo-feudalist system where only a very small percentage of unelected people reap the rewards of the system. And so, as I said, a kind of new feudalism. And in that new feudalistic system, you have to remove upward mobility for all but a very few. And so, for example, CBDC, a universal digital currency, which maybe morphs into UBI for all the millions of people who become unemployed at this displacement, such as farmers like this, with a digital currency tethered and linked to the government's programmable controls. Does it really seem like that crazy? That crazy a suggestion? Like I said, the whole thing might collapse once these people, these civil service bods who created much of this, along with their World Economic Forum overlords, realize that, the zombie apocalypse is only 3 or 4 days away if we can't put food on the shelves. So maybe sticking a huge, big, Greta Thunberg-shaped fist into the spokes of food production are going to create chaos. Or maybe not. Maybe the whole thing is just theatre. Well, my friends, my money, my choice. Like I said, hello me, meet the real me, the irritating political me. Agitators Anonymous, episode 116, My Money, My Choice. It's about personal financial freedom and the potential implications of certain things that are happening within the system, and how governments and states around the world are going to potentially co-opt digital currency. Or maybe not. Until next time, enjoy your speed metal weekend, my friends.